She collapsed outside his garage and said just 3 words. "Can you fix this?" He thought she was talking about her wheelchair, but he didn't know that soon he would have to fix his own heart. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The mornings in the small town were always quiet, broken only by the distant hum of trucks heading to the highway and the occasional bark of a dog. For Edward Harris, mornings meant routine, and routine was the only anchor that had kept him steady these past years. He rose early, sometimes before the sun, brewed himself the strongest coffee he could stand, and walked across the gravel drive to his garage. The garage was not just his workplace, it was his refuge, the one place where the noise of memory seemed to recede into the background. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of motor oil, steel, and wood dust. Every shelf was lined with tools in precise order, sockets and wrenches gleaming under the fluorescent lights, cans of grease and spray stacked neatly, and old rags folded in a way only a man clinging to control would bother with. On the far side of the garage, beside an old workbench, sat a framed photograph. His wife's face, frozen in time, smiled at him every day. She had been gone for years now, taken by an illness that devoured her strength and left him with silence. Edward could never bring himself to remove her things. Her favorite mug still lingered on the shelf in the kitchen, a cardigan draped over a chair in their bedroom, as though she might walk back through the door and demand he fix the squeaky hinge she used to complain about. His 6-year-old daughter, Emma, had grown up with these relics around her, quietly understanding that they were sacred, though she sometimes asked if Daddy was sad when he looked at the picture. He always told her no, but the truth was a weight he carried silently, a burden he couldn't yet release. Emma was the light in his otherwise dim world. That morning, she was already up, dressed in a faded shirt with cartoon cars and jeans that had been patched at the knees. She darted in and out of the garage, dragging along a plastic toy car, making engine noises with her lips. She mimicked his movements, sometimes taking a small wrench and pretending to fix her toy. Edward always smiled at her antics, though the smile never quite reached his eyes. He had grown used to the rhythm of his life, the sound of turning bolts, the quiet companionship of his daughter, the shadows of memory lingering at the edges. It was steady, predictable, and safe. And then, on one particular morning, that quiet balance shifted. As Edward pushed open the wide metal doors of the garage to let in the pale sunlight, he saw something unusual just outside the gates. At first, he thought it was a bundle of clothes left on the ground, but then the shape moved. A young woman, maybe 25, sat awkwardly on the gravel, her hands braced on the ground, her face pale but composed. Beside her lay an overturned wheelchair, one wheel still spinning slowly, as though mocking the fall. Edward froze for a moment, the wrench in his hand, slipping unconsciously to the floor. Emma stopped her play and looked up at him, sensing his unease. The woman raised her head, her expression calm but weary. She did not cry or scream. She simply met his eyes and spoke, her voice steady, though tinged with strain. "Could you help me?" The chair. It gave out on me. For a heartbeat, Edward's instincts warred within him. He had spent years avoiding strangers, avoiding anything that might pull him into lives that weren't his. Yet the sight of her, determined to maintain dignity despite the fall, stirred something he had almost forgotten. He hurried forward, carefully lifting the chair upright, then extending his hands to her. She shifted into the seat with practiced effort, though he noticed the slight tremor in her arms, the way her breath hitched as she settled. Emma stood by the garage doorway, wide-eyed. Her curiosity was stronger than fear, and she clutched the edge of the door as though it were a stage curtain, shielding her from the unknown. "Thank you," the woman said, brushing dust from her clothes. Her hair was chestnut brown, pulled back loosely, with strands escaping around her face. She wore a simple jacket and jeans, clothes that had seen wear but were clean, practical. "I'm sorry to trouble you. The wheel locked up and threw me off. I didn't mean to cause a scene." Edward shook his head. "No trouble. Do you need me to take a look?" She gave him a tentative smile. "If you don't mind. They don't make these things to last. And the repair shops, well, let's just say they're not exactly eager to help." He wheeled her inside the garage, clearing a space near the workbench. His hands, so used to engines and chains, found the unfamiliar mechanics of the chair oddly intuitive. The wheel had slipped its alignment, the brake bent from strain. As he set to work, she watched him with quiet interest, her hands resting on her lap. "I'm Sarah," she said after a moment, breaking the silence. "Sarah Miller. I just moved here a few weeks ago, staying with my sister on the other side of town." Edward only nodded, focused on the bolts. "Edward Harris." He hesitated, then added, "Most people just call me Ed." From the doorway, Emma piped up with her small, bright voice. "I'm Emma!" Sarah turned her gaze to the little girl and smiled warmly. "Well, hello there, Emma. That's a lovely name." Emma edged closer, emboldened by the friendliness in Sarah's tone. "Why do you have a chair with wheels?" Edward stiffened, about to scold his daughter for rudeness, but Sarah laughed softly, the sound light, almost melodic. "Because my legs don't like to do the walking anymore. So the chair helps me go places. It's not as fun as running, but it gets the job done." Emma considered this seriously, then nodded. "It's like my toy car. It doesn't go unless I push it." Sarah chuckled. "Exactly. We're not so different, your car and me." Edward listened in silence as he worked, tightening the screws, straightening the bent brake. He couldn't remember the last time laughter had filled the garage in such a natural way. He glanced at Sarah once, noticing how she carried herself, not with the defeat he might have expected, but with a kind of resilience. Her eyes were bright, even after a fall, and she had a way of disarming the awkwardness with humor. After some time, the chair stood steady again. Edward tested the wheels, rolled it back and forth, and nodded with satisfaction. "That should do it. You'll want to be careful on uneven ground, though. The axle was bent. I straightened it, but it could use a replacement eventually." Sarah smiled. "Thank you. I don't know what I'd have done if you weren't here." Edward shrugged, wiping his hands on a rag. "Just happened to be the right place, right time." From her seat, Sarah pulled a small thermos out of her bag and unscrewed the lid. "At least let me share this. Coffee. Not much, but it's hot." He hesitated, then accepted. They sat in silence, sipping the bitter drink, the only sound the quiet clink of tools settling, and Emma's toy car rolling across the floor. Sarah seemed content, not rushing to leave, and Edward, though unsure why, didn't mind her lingering. When she finally wheeled herself toward the door, Emma followed, waving energetically. "Come back again," she called, as though the woman were already a friend. Sarah looked over her shoulder, her eyes meeting Edward's briefly before settling on Emma. "Maybe I will." Edward stood in the doorway, watching her move slowly down the road. The morning sun caught the curve of her shoulders, the faint determination in her movements. He felt an unfamiliar stirring in his chest, a ripple across the still surface of his carefully guarded life. He told himself it was nothing, just a stranger passing through. Yet as the distance grew, he couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted, that a door long closed had quietly opened again. He turned back inside, finding Emma holding the photograph of her mother. She looked at him solemnly. "She was pretty, Daddy. Do you think she'd like Sarah?" The question cut deeper than he expected. He didn't answer, only ruffled Emma's hair and muttered something about washing up for breakfast. But as he worked through the rest of the day, the image of Sarah sitting in the garage, laughing gently with his daughter, refused to leave him. And though Edward had lived years in the safety of solitude, that night, lying awake, he realized with unease and a faint trace of hope that his life might no longer belong only to the past. The days that followed were quiet again, though not in quite the same way. Edward carried on with his routine, fixing cars and bicycles, sweeping the garage floor, and making sure Emma was fed and happy. Yet something had shifted inside him. The garage no longer felt only like a refuge. It also felt like a stage upon which something unexpected might happen. He caught himself glancing toward the road more often, as if expecting to see the young woman appear again. He told himself it was unlikely, that she had only stopped because she needed help. But the memory of her laugh, the ease with which she spoke to Emma, lingered in his mind like the aftertaste of strong coffee. It was Emma who voiced what he would not admit to himself. She asked almost every evening whether Sarah would come back, and she drew pictures where the three of them appeared together. One morning, she proudly held up a sketch of a house with 3 figures outside. One was Edward, tall and solid. Another was herself with a toy car in her hand, and beside them, a woman with a chair that had wheels. Emma had even drawn flowers around the chair, as if to make it part of a garden. Edward felt the sting of something he could not name. He wanted to scold her, to tell her not to imagine things, but he couldn't bring himself to. Instead, he took the drawing, pinned it on the wall of the garage, and said nothing more. A few days later, as he was tightening the bolts on a stubborn old truck engine, he heard the faint sound of wheels outside. He wiped his hands and stepped out, half expecting and half dreading what he already knew. Sarah was there, maneuvering her chair carefully over the gravel. She wore the same jacket as before, but this time she seemed less weary, more prepared for the encounter. "Looks like I'm back," she said with a wry smile. "Hope you don't mind repeat customers." Edward glanced at the chair and noticed the loose armrest. "What happened?" "It gave up on me. Either that, or it's protesting too much use," she said lightly. "I figured if you could fix the wheel, you could probably handle this too." Emma squealed with delight, running out from the house and flinging her arms around Sarah in an unfiltered gesture of affection. Sarah laughed and held her close, her eyes softening. Edward felt a pang in his chest, a mixture of joy and unease. The sight of them together was too easy, too natural. Inside the garage, Edward began working on the armrest, while Sarah and Emma chatted nearby. Emma peppered her with questions about what she liked to eat, whether she had pets, if she knew how to draw. Sarah answered every question patiently, sometimes turning the conversation back to Emma and her favorite games. Edward listened silently, the sound of their voices washing over him, reminding him of something long absent. Warmth. When the repair was done, Sarah stayed longer than before. She told them stories about her life before the accident, how she had studied architecture, her love for climbing hills and sketching buildings, her plans to design homes that felt alive. Her voice trembled only slightly when she spoke of the day everything changed, the accident that left her bound to a chair. She did not linger on the pain, but spoke instead of the battle to rebuild herself, to find meaning again. Edward, usually reserved, found himself answering her honesty with his own. He spoke haltingly of his wife, of the illness that had taken her, and the hollow nights that followed. He had never shared this with anyone outside his daughter, but Sarah's gaze was steady, free of pity. She did not flinch away from his grief, and in that simple act, something loosened in him. The days became weeks, and Sarah's visits grew more frequent. Sometimes it was the chair that needed a touch. Sometimes it was simply an excuse to talk. Emma began asking if Sarah could join them for meals, and one evening, Edward finally agreed. The three of them sat at the old wooden table in his kitchen. Edward had cooked something simple: fried potatoes, a bit of meat, and a salad. It was the kind of food he had made countless times for himself and Emma, yet sharing it with Sarah gave it a new significance. She laughed and said it was the best meal she'd had in ages. Emma, in her innocence, asked a question that struck like a stone dropped into still water. "Are you going to be my mom?" Edward nearly dropped his fork. He wanted to silence her, but Sarah reached out and touched Emma's hand gently. "I don't know about that," she said softly, "but I can be your friend. A very good friend." The air grew quiet, but not uncomfortable. Edward's heart thudded in his chest. He watched Sarah and Emma together, the way Emma leaned against her, the way Sarah smiled at her as if she had known her all her life. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder what it would mean to have someone else at the table again, someone who wasn't only a memory. Yet with closeness came conflict. The town was small, and small towns bred gossip. It wasn't long before Edward overheard whispers. Some said it was odd that a man like him would spend time with a young woman in a chair. Others hinted that he was desperate, unable to find anyone else. Their words pricked at him, planting seeds of doubt. He grew quieter around Sarah, less open, and once even avoided her when she came to the garage. When she noticed, Sarah did not stay silent. One afternoon, she rolled into the garage unannounced, her eyes sharp with determination. "Are you avoiding me, Edward?" she asked. He looked away, fumbling with a wrench. "I just thought. Maybe it's better if we kept some distance. People are talking." Her voice was calm but firm. "Let them talk. You think I haven't dealt with whispers? I've been stared at, pitied, ignored, and dismissed since the accident. But I won't let other people's smallness dictate my life, and I won't let it dictate yours either." He met her gaze then, seeing the fire in her eyes. She wasn't asking for protection. She wasn't fragile. She was strong, stronger than he had realized, and she demanded honesty, not excuses. Edward felt shame flush through him. He had hidden behind his fear, behind the memory of his wife, behind the safety of routine. But Sarah was offering him something different, a chance to live again. That night, Edward sat alone in his living room after Emma had gone to bed. He stared at the photograph of his wife and whispered into the silence, "I don't want to forget you. But maybe I can't keep holding on like this." His words dissolved into the shadows, but they lingered in his heart as a fragile promise. And though he did not know what the days ahead would bring, he knew one thing with certainty. Sarah had already become more than just a stranger who had rolled into his life. She had become the beginning of something he had thought impossible, a bridge back to trust, to laughter, and perhaps to love. The weeks that followed carried with them a rhythm Edward had not known in years, a rhythm that was no longer governed solely by bolts and wrenches or the steady hum of the garage. Sarah became part of their days, sometimes expected, sometimes arriving like a surprise at the edge of morning. Emma, who once clung only to her father, now rushed to meet Sarah with an unguarded joy, showing her drawings, telling her stories, asking endless questions. And Edward, though still cautious with his heart, felt himself softening, loosening the armor he had carried since his wife's passing. There were moments when he caught himself smiling without forcing it, laughing at a small joke, even forgetting the constant shadow of grief that had weighed him down for so long. Yet shadows were never far away, and he knew that in a town like theirs, silence was rarely private. The gossip did not end. He overheard it at the grocery store, murmured as he passed, even disguised as concern from neighbors. Some asked whether it was wise to let his daughter grow attached to a woman who would always need help. Others whispered that he was rushing into something that could not last. Edward tried to ignore it, but the words pressed against him like stones. And yet, every time he saw Sarah's eyes meet Emma's with warmth, Every time he heard their shared laughter, he felt certain that those voices were nothing more than noise from a world that had forgotten what it meant to truly care. The moment that changed everything came on a gray afternoon, when the sky hung heavy with clouds and the streets were slick with recent rain. Sarah had gone into town to pick up a few small things, determined to move about her world without relying on others. Edward had offered to drive her, but she insisted, as she often did, that she was capable. He trusted her strength, though part of him always worried. That day, his worry became reality. She had been crossing one of the uneven intersections when the front wheel of her chair caught in a crack in the pavement. The chair lurched violently, and she was thrown forward, grasping for balance that would not come. Passers-by looked on, some with pity, others with that uncomfortable detachment people wear when they do not want to get involved. A few slowed, then hurried on, unwilling to step into someone else's struggle. Sarah tried to right herself, but the chair was heavy, the wheel bent beyond use. She sat on the cold ground, dignity intact, but her frustration plain, as the world continued around her. It was Emma's small voice that broke through. She had been holding her father's hand as they turned onto the street, and when she saw Sarah, she let go and ran ahead without hesitation. "Don't be afraid," she said, her tiny hand slipping into Sarah's, her face serious with a child's pure loyalty. "We're here. You're not alone." Edward hurried forward, heart pounding. Without a word, he lifted the chair, examined the bent wheel, and crouched down to work as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His hands, steady from years of labor, moved with certainty, and though the chair was beyond quick repair, he managed to adjust it enough to roll again. The people who had once walked past now stood watching, a few embarrassed, others curious. Edward ignored them all. His focus was only on Sarah and the small girl holding her hand. When Sarah looked at him, her eyes shone not with shame, but with something else. Something deeper gratitude mixed with recognition. She knew then what Edward had already begun to understand. Their lives were no longer parallel lines that brushed only by chance. They were entwined, bound not by pity or necessity, but by choice. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Edward sat alone in the living room. The photograph of his wife watched him from the mantel, her smile eternal. For years he had clung to that smile as a tether to the life he had lost, terrified that letting go would mean forgetting. But now he saw it differently. He did not want to erase her, nor could he. Her presence was a part of him, stitched into his heart. Yet he realized that holding on so tightly had kept him from living, from giving Emma the life she deserved, from seeing the possibility of joy again. With trembling hands, he gathered the few belongings of hers he had left in daily sight, the mug, the cardigan, the photograph. He did not throw them away. He placed them carefully into a box, folded with respect, touched with reverence. It was not an act of erasure, but of acknowledgement. He whispered into the stillness, "Thank you for everything. I'll carry you always. But I think it's time." His voice cracked, but when the words were spoken, he felt lighter, as if a door had finally opened inside him. The next morning, Edward asked Sarah to meet him at the garage. She arrived with a hint of apprehension, as though uncertain whether this was to be another repair or something heavier. The garage smelled as it always did, of oil and dust and effort, but today it felt different, charged with anticipation. Edward stood by the workbench, holding something in his hands. When she rolled closer, she saw it was a bracelet, simple and unadorned, fashioned from a small piece of metal carefully bent into form. It gleamed faintly in the light, and Sarah recognized it immediately, The fragment came from the chair he had repaired that very first day. "This was the start of everything," he said, his voice low but steady. "You came into my life with a broken wheel, and I thought all I was doing was fixing a machine. But it was more than that. You reminded me how to speak again, how to laugh, how to breathe. You reminded me that I could live, and I don't want to go back to the way it was before. Sarah, I want you with us, not just as a visitor, not just as a friend. I want you as part of this family. Will you marry me?" For a long moment, silence filled the garage, broken only by the sound of Emma's footsteps as she peeked from the doorway, sensing something important. Sarah's eyes brimmed with tears, and she lifted her hands to her mouth as though to catch the sob rising there. Then, with a trembling laugh, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, and the word was both fragile and unshakable. Emma darted forward and hugged them both as tightly as her little arms could manage. "I knew it!" she cried, her joy unrestrained. The wedding was simple, held in the open space behind the garage where Edward had spent so much of his life. Friends and neighbors gathered, some out of curiosity, others with genuine warmth. There were no grand decorations, only a few flowers picked from nearby gardens, a ribbon or two strung across the chairs. Sarah wore a plain white dress that fell gracefully over her chair, adorned with a garland Emma had made. Edward stood beside her, not in a suit, but in his best shirt, his hand clasping hers as though he would never let go. The vows were short, unembellished, spoken from hearts that had already been tested by loss. Edward promised not only to love her, but to stand with her, to honor the strength that had carried her through darkness. Sarah promised not only to love him, but to share the life they had begun to build, to be there for Emma, as though she were her own. When the ceremony ended, there was applause, not the kind reserved for spectacle, but the kind that rises from genuine affection. Later that evening, as the guests departed and the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, the three of them sat together outside the garage. Emma leaned against Sarah, tired but happy, while Edward looked out at the fading light. For the first time in years, he felt at peace, not because his grief was gone, it never would be, but because he had found the courage to let life move forward. The garage still smelled of oil and steel, the same as it always had. But now, beneath that scent, there was something new. The warmth of laughter, the softness of shared moments, the promise of a future not bound by loneliness, but strengthened by love. And as the night settled over them, Edward knew he had not betrayed the past by stepping into this new life. He had honored it by finally allowing himself to live. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are many more stories to discover. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too important to keep to yourself.